A teamster passing through Millstone Ford asked why the old Norwegian was hauling split oak into a cave 3 miles uphill. The men at the general store laughed. The storekeeper had the best line. He said the old man was stacking summer inside a hole because winter talked to him in his sleep. Boys dared each other to run to the cave mouth and shout his name before the lantern light appeared. Up on the bluff, the old man set another split of white oak on the rails, bark side down, a hand width of air between each row. He did not look toward town. Tullif Brekka had not slept inside Millstone Ford for 3 days when he found the cave. Before that morning, before the lantern light on Limestone, before any of it, there was the meeting house. A Sunday in late October, 1885. Rain tapping the cedar shingles in a rhythm Tullif had not heard since he was 9 years old in Telemark. Not the hard drumming of a proper storm. A soft, warm, patient sound. Water that had no business being warm in late October, falling on ground that had already frozen twice. He sat in the back pew with mud on his boots and bark dust in his beard. 63 years old, thin in the shoulders, thick in the hands. A trapper who had outlived his trade. His wife was 7 years dead. His son had gone to railroad work in Kansas City and stopped writing. What Tullif had left was a dog trot cabin with a failing roof, 2 steel traps, a broad axe, a cross-cut saw with 3 missing teeth, and a mule named Svan whose hooves were cracking from the dry autumn rock. He also had the thing nobody wanted, a memory of ice. Reverend Niles Cresswell was mid-sentence when Tullif stood. The Reverend was talking about the grace of provision, about how the Lord had given Shannon County a mild autumn and sound timber. Tullif did not wait for the pause between verses. He spoke from the back row in a voice roughened by decades of creek bottom cold. "That rain is warm," he said. "Listen to it. It is not sleet. It is not snow. It is warm water falling on frozen ground, and when the temperature drops tonight, every stick of wood in every open pile in this town will wear a shell of ice you cannot break with a splitting maul." The meeting house went quiet, not the respectful silence of agreement, the tight silence of embarrassment. Children pressed against their mothers on the stove benches. Women looked at the floor. Tullif could smell wet wool steaming near the iron stove, boot mud drying white on the plank floor, tallow candles guttering from the draft where the door did not seal. Orrin Satterwhite stood from the second pew. 49 years old, storekeeper, woodbroker, and the man who held paper on half the cabins in Millstone Ford. He wore a clean coat. His boots were oiled. He had the posture of a man who had never carried his own firewood past the age of 30. "Reverend," Orrin said, "I believe Brekka has interrupted the Lord's service to tell us about the weather." Laughter. Not much, but enough. Tullif did not sit. "Exposed woodpiles will become coffins," he said. "Every family in this room has 4 to 6 cords stacked under split rail covers that will not stop wind-driven freezing rain. When the ice seals those piles, you will have houses full of children and stoves full of nothing." Orrin turned to face the room. "This is the 3rd autumn Brekka has stood in this building and told us the sky is falling. 3 years of this. Glaze storms, ice prophecies. The man sees doom in a rain puddle." Dr. Amos Vardaman spoke from the side bench without standing. 58. Former Civil War surgeon. The only man in Millstone Ford who had seen more death than Tullif and carried more authority because of it. His voice was calm, clinical, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts. "Winter kills through fever, hunger, and exposure," Vardaman said. "Not through storybook ice. We have weathered sleet before. Exposed piles can be chopped loose. Men with axes do not freeze beside their own wood." Tullif looked at Vardaman. He had no argument against credentials. He had only the sound of rain on a cedar roof in a rhythm he had heard once before, 40 years ago, in a country where his mother had pressed his hand to the cold wall of a root cellar and told him to remember how stone holds warmth when everything outside has forgotten it. "You are hearing what you want to hear," Tullif said to Vardaman. "I'm hearing what the rain is telling me." That was the sentence that finished him. Constable Reuben Vale read the order the next morning. Tolliff was banned from sleeping within town limits. The charges were specific: frightening children, accusing neighbors of negligence, and threatening to split the church door for emergency kindling. That last charge was from a different argument 6 weeks prior, but Orrin had kept it useful. Tolliff had 3 days to collect his belongings. He had $11 in coin, half a sack of cornmeal, a mule with cracked hooves that could not carry a full load up a ridge without stopping twice, and one small cabin that Orrin now claimed as debt security for an unpaid store account of $9.40. He stood in the road with Svan's lead rope in his hand and watched smoke rising from 28 chimneys, 28 households, each one believing their outdoor woodpile was enough. 4 to 6 cords per family, stacked in open yards, under covers built for snow, not for warm rain that freezes on contact. He could see the piles from where he stood: oak, hickory, some cedar, good wood, dry wood, wood that would burn clean and hot if a match could reach it. But a match cannot reach wood sealed under ice, and an axe cannot split a log wearing a glass skin without shattering the edge or skidding into a shin bone. Tolliff had watched his uncle try it once in Telemark. The man had opened his own knee to the bone before the first split cracked free. The town did not understand the math. Tolliff did, and the math was simple. One household could survive 3 days on indoor kindling. After that, if the outdoor pile was locked, the family had to beg from neighbors whose piles were equally locked, or they had to burn furniture, or they had to leave. And in Shannon County in December, leaving meant walking 12 miles to the nearest settlement with nothing but the clothes that were already failing to keep you warm. Tolliff led Svan north along the creek road with a quarter sack of meal tied to the mule's back and a broad axe across his own shoulder. He did not look back, not because he was proud, but because he already knew what he needed, and it was not behind him. He needed a place where rain could not reach fuel, a place where ice could not form on wood, a place that stayed the same temperature whether the surface was 50 degrees or 15 below zero. He needed stone. The cave was 3 miles above Millstone Ford, set into a bluff of Burlington limestone above the spring line. Locals called it Bell Hollow Cave because the entrance arch threw back echoes when boys shouted into it, which they did every spring until their mothers dragged them away. Most adults avoided it. Bats. Old bones from something large and long dead. A story about a moonshiner named Galt, who had gone in past the back fissure 20 years ago and never come out, though Tolliff suspected Galt had simply walked out the other side of the ridge and kept going because he owed money to people less patient than Orrin Satterwhite. Tolliff knew the entrance from years of trapping foxes along the bluff. What he had never done was walk the full interior with a purpose beyond skinning. On his first night of exile, he tied Svan to a cedar stump, lit a tallow lantern, and stepped inside. The entrance passage was narrow and damp for 20 paces. Then the ceiling lifted. The floor changed from mud to dry gravel. The walls opened into a chamber broad enough that his lantern could not reach both sides at once. He stood still and listened. No water dripping, no stream running. The air moved, a faint pull from somewhere deep in the rear, which meant the cave breathed. Ventilation. The ceiling was blackened in patches from old campfires, which meant someone, years ago, had found this same room and stayed long enough to burn wood in it. He hung his wet wool mitten on a limestone ledge near the chamber mouth and walked deeper. The air was cool, but not cold. He had no thermometer, but his skin knew the difference between December air and root cellar air. This was root cellar air. Constant. Patient. The kind of temperature that did not care what the sky was doing. By morning, the mitten's outside edge was stiff from the entrance draft. The inside edge, 6 paces deeper, was merely cool, damp, but not frozen. He held it to his face and breathed through it. His mother's lesson came back whole, not as words, but as the weight of her hand pressing his small fingers against cold lime wash. Stone does not make heat. Stone slows the theft of it. The town stored its wood where rain could reach it, where wind could drive freezing water between the splits and seal each log in a glass coffin. Tolliff would store wood where rain could not enter, where wind died at the entrance, and where the chamber's steady temperature kept fuel above the point where ice could form on its surface. He did not need the cave to warm the town. He needed the cave to keep wood catchable, dry wood that a match could reach, seasoned oak that would light on birch bark and burn clean and hot, while every exposed pile in Millstone Ford sat useless under its crystal armor. The idea sounded simple. The execution was something else. 40 cords. That was the number. 28 households needing heat, one stove at a time, rationed carefully. 40 cords of split oak, mostly dead-standing post oak and white oak from the ridge, stacked on raised platforms so groundwater could not wick upward. Locust rails lifting the first tier 18 inches off the gravel floor. Drainage trenches along both walls to channel any seep away from the stacks. Chalk lines marking the drip paths from the ceiling so no pile sat under a wet spot. Every 10th row cross-laid like a log cabin corner to prevent the wall of wood from bowing outward and collapsing. 5,120 cubic feet of fuel in a cave, gathered by one man with a lame mule and $11. Tolliff had no one to tell the idea to, which was the only mercy. Because spoken aloud, it sounded like the ravings of a man who had finally cracked under the weight of loneliness and obsession. Glaze Brecca, they already called him. 3 years of warnings that had come to nothing. 3 autumns of watching the sky and telling people who did not want to listen that their woodpiles were traps waiting to spring. Now he sat in a cave with a lantern and a piece of chalk, drawing the outline of raised platforms on the gravel floor, and the only witness was a mule who would not enter the cave mouth no matter how hard Tolliff pulled the rope. But the physics did not care about reputation. Dry wood burns, wet wood does not. Ice-sealed wood cannot be split. Cave-stored wood cannot be ice-sealed. The chain was simple and unbreakable, and every link was a fact that Vardaman and Satterwhite and every nodding head in that meeting house had chosen not to examine, because the man presenting it smelled like creek water and mule sweat. Peter Vangen found him on the 3rd day. Peter was 41, a teamster who hauled timber and freight between Millstone Ford and Eminence. Not a cruel man, not a supporter. The kind of neighbor who would lend you a wrench but not defend you at a town meeting. He had a round face, a bad left knee from a wagon accident, and an opinion about everything that involved wood because wood was what he hauled. He rode up the bluff trail on a sorrel mare and found Tolliff splitting dead post oak into stove lengths beside the cave entrance. Splits piled waist high, bark chips scattered across the gravel. Tolliff's hands were already raw, and he had been cutting for less than 2 days. Peter did not dismount. He looked at the cave mouth, looked at the wood, looked at Tolliff. "You're putting firewood inside a cave," Peter said. "I am." "Wood belongs in sun and wind," Peter said. "Every man who has ever seasoned a cord knows that. Air dries it. Sun bakes the water out. You put wood underground, you get mildew, you get rot, you get soft punk that smokes and spits and will not hold a coal." Tolliff set the axe head on the ground and leaned on the handle. His shoulders ached. His right palm had a blister the size of a $50 that had already torn open and stuck to the axe wrap. "Come inside," Tolliff said. Peter did not want to, but curiosity is harder to kill than pride, and Peter had always been a man who needed to see a thing before he dismissed it. He tied the mare beside Svan and followed Tolliff through the narrow entrance passage into the broad upper chamber. The air hit him first, not cold, not warm, steady. The gravel floor was dry. The ceiling was high enough that the lantern light died before it reached the top. Tolliff had already laid the first row of locust rails across the chamber floor, 18 inches high, spaced 2 hand widths apart. "Feel the floor," Tolliff said. Peter knelt and pressed his hand to the gravel. Dry. He picked up a handful and let it fall through his fingers. No moisture, no mud. "Now feel the wall," Tolliff said. Peter pressed his palm flat against the limestone. Cool, but not damp. Not sweating. The stone was dry and stable, and the air moving through the chamber was steady enough that Peter could feel it on the wet spot where his collar met his neck. "This cave breathes," Tolliff said. "There's a crack in the rear that pulls air through. The floor is gravel over limestone, and it drains. The chamber sits above the spring line. No stream, no seep along the main floor. I have marked 3 drip lines from the ceiling, and the stacks will sit clear of all 3. Mildew needs moisture, Pater said. It was not a concession. It was a man testing his own objection and finding it weakened. I am not storing green wood, Tolliff said. Dead standing oak, post oak and white oak, already air-dried on the stump. I split it to stove length, stack it bark down on the lower tiers so water cannot pool in the curl, and leave a hand width of air between every row. The cave does not need to dry the wood. The wood is already dry. The cave needs to keep it dry. Pater stood. He wiped his hand on his trousers and looked at the first row of rails, the chalk lines on the gravel, the careful geometry of a man who had thought this through with the same precision he used to read weather. How much? Pater asked. 40 cords. Pater laughed. Not mocking laughter, the involuntary kind that escapes when a number is so large it sounds like a different language. Tolliff, he said, you are one man with a lame mule. 40 cords is a winter's work for a crew of 4 with good teams and a log road. You have no road, no team, and no one willing to be seen helping you. I know. Oren is telling people you have gone to ground like a sick animal. He says you are dangerous. He's looking for a way to claim whatever you stack as abandoned debt property, since you still owe on the cabin. Tolliff picked up the axe. Then I had better fill the cave before Oren finds the law he's looking for. Pater did not offer to help. He mounted the mare and looked down at Tolliff from the saddle. If you are wrong, Pater said, you will have spent the last good months of your life dragging firewood into a hole in the ground while everyone in town ate warm meals and slept in beds. And if I am right, Tolliff said, those warm meals and soft beds will last until the first chimney goes cold. Then we will see who remembers the man in the cave. Pater left. Tolliff split oak until his hands bled through the wrapping. Svan stood at the cave mouth, ears forward, watching the sky. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled warm and wrong, the way it smells before something changes that cannot be changed back. The town made a comedy of him. Within a week of his banishment, Tolliff Brecca hauling split oak into a dark cave had become the best entertainment Millstone Ford had seen since a traveling dentist pulled Widow Henning's wrong tooth. Children dared each other to stand at the cave mouth and listen to the old man's axe ring off the limestone walls. Boys made a game of it, run to the entrance, shout Glaze Brecca, and scatter before the lantern light appeared. Men at Satterwhite's store called the hoard Brecca's underground forest. A teamster passing through asked if the old Norwegian was planting trees in the dark, and the line got repeated 3 times before sundown. Reverend Cresswell worked it into a midweek sermon about the sin of fearful prophecy, how a man who sees only winter in every season has turned his back on the Lord's provision. Women who had once traded eggs for Tolliff's pelts stopped meeting his eyes at the creek crossing, not from anger. From the specific discomfort of watching someone you once considered merely strange cross the line into something that might be madness. Oren Satterwhite watched with more purpose than anyone. He rode to the cave on a Tuesday afternoon in early November with 2 men Tolliff did not recognize, hired labor from downriver, the kind of men who appeared when Oren needed someone to stand behind him and look like a consequence. Tolliff was inside the chamber, stacking his 7th cord by lantern light. The splits were arranged bark down on the locust rails, air gaps between every row, just as he had described to Pater. The precision was visible even in poor light. Each row was even. Each gap was consistent. The chalk lines on the gravel marked drip zones, drainage channels, and the 3-foot clearance from the cave walls that kept the stacks from touching wet stone. Oren ducked through the entrance and stood in the chamber with his coat buttoned to the throat. He looked at the stacks. He looked at the rails. He looked at Tolliff, who had set down a split of white oak and was standing with both hands at his sides, breathing hard. You hiding fire from honest people now? Oren said. I am hiding it from the sky, Tolliff said. Oren laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from a man who believes he is witnessing proof of everything he has been saying. He turned to the men behind him. Remember that line, Oren said. When Brekka comes begging for a stove corner in January, I want someone to remind him he was hiding fire from the sky. Tolif said nothing. Oren stepped closer. His boots crunched on the gravel. I want you to understand something, Brekka. That cabin you abandoned is mine now. $9.40, and the constable has the paper. But this wood you are stacking on public land in a cave that belongs to no claim, this is something else. You are cutting deadfall from ridges where paying customers have standing rights. Every cord you drag in here is a cord that should have gone to my yard, where I sell it properly, to people who pay their accounts. The deadfall was on the ground, Tolif said. No one was cutting it. Because no one was fool enough to haul it 3 miles uphill into a hole. The two hired men shifted behind Oren. One of them was looking at the stacks with something that was not mockery. Tolif saw it and did not acknowledge it. There was no point in finding allies among men who were paid to stand on the other side. I'm looking into the law, Oren said. If this cave sits on county land, and I believe it does, then anything stored here without a claim is abandoned property. You are building me a very nice woodpile, Brekka. I may have to thank you. He turned and left. The two men followed. Tolif stood in the lantern light and listened to the hooves fade down the bluff trail. Then he picked up the next split, set it bark down on the rail, and left a hand width of air before reaching for the one after it. He could not afford to stop. He could not afford to think about Oren's legal threat, because thinking would not change the law, and it would not stack wood. What he could do was cut, split, haul, and stack. Every cord inside the cave was a cord the ice could not reach. Every split on the rails was a match strike closer to enough. His hands were cracked from the axe handle, and the cracks filled with limestone dust that burned when he washed at the creek. His shoulders had stopped aching in the normal way and begun aching in the way that meant he was using muscle. He did not have enough food to rebuild. Half a sack of meal was nearly gone. $11 was now $8, spent on salt, axle grease for Svan's hooves, and a new wrap for the axe handle after the old one tore away at the blood-soaked spot. 7 cords inside, 33 to go. The first frost had already come and gone. The oaks on the high ridges were bare. Hickory leaves came down in sheets that stuck to the mud on the trail. Every day was shorter. Every morning the creek ice reached a little farther from the banks, and nobody in Millstone Ford was watching the sky the way Tolif watched it. Nobody was counting the days between warm rain and hard freeze, measuring the gap, calculating what happened when that gap closed to 0. 33 cords. 1 man. 1 mule with bad hooves. A cave that might be seized. And a winter that Tolif Brekka could feel in his teeth, settling over the Ozark hills like a hand pressing down on a candle flame. He split another log, set it on the rail, left the gap, reached for the next. The cave did not care about his reputation. The cave only asked whether the wood was dry and the stacks were sound. That was a question Tolif could answer. Whether it would be enough was the question the winter would ask. And winter, unlike Oren Satterwhite, did not negotiate. Barbara Ossen came to the cave on the 9th day of November, carrying a basket of turnips and a carpenter's square. She was 71 years old. Small in the way that old Norwegian women are small, compressed by decades of labor into something dense and hard, like heartwood. Her husband, Mikkel Ossen, had burned charcoal and worked a lime kiln in Crawford County until a kiln collapse took him in 1873. Since then, Barbro had lived alone on a quarter section south of Millstone Ford, keeping goats, selling butter, and speaking to almost no one except when she had something to say that silence could not carry. She had heard about Tolif's banishment the way everyone heard things in Shannon County, through the general store, where gossip moved faster than freight. But what caught her attention was not the banishment. It was the word Tolif had used, glaze. Not storm, not ice, not freeze. Glaze. The specific word for warm rain over frozen ground that seals everything it touches in a clear shell. Barbro knew that word the way Tolif knew it, not from books, but from watching it happen, in a country where the difference between those words was the difference between an inconvenience and a catastrophe. She stood at the cave mouth and watched Tolef stack splits by lantern light. She watched for nearly 10 minutes before she spoke. She was studying the work, not the man. "Your third row from the top will bow outward before Christmas," she said. Tolef turned. He did not recognize her immediately. He saw a small woman in a heavy coat with a carpenter's square under one arm and a basket in the other, and his first thought was that Oren had sent someone to assess the wood for seizure. "Who are you?" he asked. "Barbro Asen. My husband built charcoal stacks taller than your head and kept them standing through wind that would flatten a shed. You are stacking wood the way a man stacks wood who knows weather, but has never built a structure that had to hold its own weight." Tolef set down the split he was holding. His hands were wrapped in torn cloth. The blisters had scabbed and reopened twice. His shoulders had a fixed ache that no longer sharpened or dulled. It simply existed, like the sound of the creek. "I am stacking it the way it fits," he said, "and it will fall the way it fits, which is outward and downward, and it will pin you under 800 pounds of oak, and no one will find you until spring." She set the basket of turnips on the gravel floor and walked into the chamber without waiting for permission. She ran her hand along the face of the nearest stack, pressing at the joints where one split rested on another. She crouched and looked at the rail spacing. She stood inside it along the top of the row, the way a carpenter sights along a board. "The rails are good," she said. "The height from the floor is right. Your drip lines are careful, but you have no cross ties. Every 6 feet you need a crib lock, 2 rows stacked perpendicular, like a cabin corner, so the long rows cannot push outward. Without crib locks, the weight of the upper rows will find the weakest joint and open it like a door." Tolef looked at the stack. He could see what she meant. The rows were uniform and tight, which felt like strength but was actually a continuous surface with no interruption to absorb lateral pressure. One split shifting under load would push the split beside it, and the force would travel the length of the row until it found the end, where there was nothing to stop it but air. "Show me," he said. Barbro picked up 2 splits from the pile and held them perpendicular to each other. "Every 6 feet. Cross 2 rows. It breaks the line. The weight goes down instead of sideways. Your charcoal burner, your lime man, your stone mason, they all know this. You are a trapper. You know animals. This is not an animal." It was not charity. Tolef understood that immediately. Barbro was not helping him because he was pitiful. She was correcting him because the work was wrong, and wrong work offended her in the same way a poorly set trap offended Tolef. She had looked at the stacks and seen a collapse, and she could not walk away from a collapse she could prevent any more than Tolef could walk away from a sky that smelled like glaze. She made him tear down 3 days of stacking, not all of it. The first 4 rows were sound because the weight above them was not yet enough to create dangerous lateral pressure. But from the 5th row up, every section needed crib locks inserted. Tolef pulled each split from the upper tiers, set it aside, built the perpendicular cross ties, and restacked the rows around them. 3 days of work undone and redone in a day and a half, with Barbro standing at the base calling corrections. "Tighter on the cross tie. Leave the gap on the long row, not the lock. The lock must be solid. The gap is where the wood breathes, not where it moves." His hands bled fresh through the wrappings. His back seized twice. Svan watched from the entrance with the disinterested patience of an animal that has seen its owner do incomprehensible things before and expects to see more. But when the restacked section was done, Tolef pressed his hand against the face of the row and pushed. Nothing moved. The crib locks held the lateral force and sent it downward into the rails, which sent it into the gravel, which did not care. Barbro nodded once. She did not say it was good. She said, "Now do the second bay the same way from the start." CTA, tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Barbro came to the cave every 3rd day. She brought turnips, sometimes dried apples, once a jar of goat butter that Tolef spread on cold cornbread, and ate standing in the lantern light because sitting down meant his back might not let him stand again. She taught him 2 more things through action, never through lecture. The first was airflow lanes. On her 3rd visit, She noticed that the growing stacks were forming a continuous wall across the chamber, blocking the draft that moved from the entrance to the rear crack. She took the carpenter's square and marked the gravel floor at 8-foot intervals. "Here," she said, "and here. 2-hand widths, floor to ceiling, open lanes. The cave breathes through the pile, or the pile sweats, and your oak turns to punk." Tolliff cut the lanes into his stacking plan. It cost him space. Each lane was 2-hand widths of storage lost, but within a week he could feel the difference. The air in the chamber moved. The front stacks nearest the entrance stayed cool and dry. The rear stacks, deepest in the chamber, stayed cool and dry. The wood did not sweat. The second teaching was test bundles. Barbro tied small bundles of 5 splits each with hemp cord and placed them at the front, middle, and rear of the chamber. Every 2 weeks, she and Tolliff lifted each bundle by hand, judging weight. She snapped a split from each bundle, smelled the break, shaved the edge with a knife, and rubbed the shaving between her fingers. "Dry," she said of the front bundle in mid-November. "Dry," she said of the middle. She paused at the rear bundle, shaved deeper, and held the shaving to the lantern. "This one holds a trace. Not enough to matter for burning, but enough to know the rear wall seeps in places your chalk did not find. Move the rear stack 6 inches forward." Tolliff moved them. 6 inches cost him half a cord of storage space. He made it up by stacking tighter in the front bay, where the air was driest and the crib locks could bear more weight. The progress was brutal and measurable. By mid-November, 14 cords stood on the rails. Svan's left front hoof had cracked deep enough that the mule limped on the downhill halls, and Tolliff started carrying splits on his own back for the final 100 yards of the uphill trail, 60 pounds at a time, 20 trips a day. By the end of November, 26 cords. Tolliff's weight had dropped until his belt wrapped past the last hole, and he punched a new one with his knife. His cough had started. Limestone dust in the chamber, chalk powder on every surface, grit in his teeth and his throat. He ate twice a day, cornmeal mush in the morning, turnips and whatever Barbro brought in the evening. The $11 was now 4. Salt was gone. The axe handle wrapping was stiff with old blood that cracked when the cold bit. Dr. Vardaman appeared at the cave in early December. He had not come to apologize. He had come because 3 people in town had mentioned that Tolliff looked like he was dying, and Vardaman, whatever his opinions about ice prophecy, was still a doctor who did not ignore reports of a man wasting. He stood at the cave entrance and looked inside. The stacks filled the chamber in ordered rows, crib-locked, air-laned, raised on locust rails. The scale of it stopped Vardaman mid-step. He had expected a sad pile of brush. He found a structure. "Brecca," he said, "you have lost 30 pounds since October." "Closer to 20, Tolliff said. "Your hands are infected. I can see the swelling from here. Your cough is site dust, and if you do not clear it, you will have it pneumonia by January. I will rest when the cave is full." Vardaman looked at the stacks again. He counted the rows, calculated the volume, and arrived at a number that did not match his expectation of a deranged hermit's woodpile. "How much is in here?" he asked. 31 cords. I need 40. Vardaman said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Your method is irrelevant if you're dead before the first snow." "Then I had better not die," Tolliff said. Vardaman left him a tin of carbolic salve and a bottle of camphor oil for the cough. He did not offer help. He did not retract his judgment from the meeting house. But he left medicine, which was something Vardaman did not do for men he considered beyond reason. The timber snake came on a warm afternoon in late November when the weather broke enough to confuse the animals. Svan reared on the trail and dumped a half-quart of splits down the slope. Tolliff spent 4 hours retrieving them from the brush, crawling on hands and knees in leaf litter and mud, hauling each split back to the trail by hand. A week later, a crib lock failed. Not from poor construction, from a split that had a hidden crack along the grain. When the weight settled, the cracked split gave way, and the upper 3 rows of the 4th section collapsed inward. Tolliff was between the stacks, adjusting an air lane. He heard the wood shift before it moved, the particular groan of oak under shearing pressure, and he threw himself sideways. The falling timber caught his left leg below the knee and pinned him against the locust rails. He could not move it alone. The weight was too great and the angle too flat to get leverage. He lay on the gravel floor in the lantern light for 2 hours, his leg going numb, until Peter Vangen appeared at the cave mouth with a load of split oak on a sled. Peter had not announced he was coming. He had not sent word. He simply appeared on the 2nd day of December with 2 wagon loads of dead oak, cut from his own back ridge, split to stove length, and loaded on a sled he had built from scrap lumber. He found Tollef pinned and did not waste time asking questions. He levered the collapsed stack with a pry pole, pulled Tollef free, and sat him against the cave wall. "Your leg is not broken," Peter said, pressing along the shin. "Bruised deep. You will limp for a week." "The crib lock failed," Tollef said. "I can see that." Peter looked at the collapsed section. "The split was cracked. You need to inspect each one before it bears weight. Tap it with the axe head. A cracked split sounds dead. A sound split rings." Tollef looked at the sled of oak. "You brought wood." Peter stood and brushed gravel from his knees. "I found my own outside pile glazed over from that freezing rain last Tuesday. 1/2 inch of ice on the top tier. I chipped it free in an hour, but the hour bothered me more than I expected." He did not say he believed Tollef. He did not say the cave was a sound idea. He said the hour bothered him, and then he unloaded 2 wagon loads of split oak and stacked them where Tollef directed, with crib locks and air lanes and the care of a man who had watched someone else do it right and learned the pattern. He came back 3 days later with another load. And 3 days after that. He never spoke of it in town. He never defended Tollef at Satterwhite's store. But the wood arrived, and by mid-December the cave held 36 cords. Orrin posted a notice on the meeting house door the same week. Any wood cut from disputed ridgeland east of the Bell Hollow Trail belonged to his store, per a timber right he claimed dated to 1879. No one could find the original document. No one challenged the notice. Tollef cut from the west ridges instead. Farther, steeper, harder on the mule, harder on the man. But the wood went into the cave just the same. By All Saints' Day, the 1st of November had passed unmarked. The count was 36 cords. By the first hard freeze in the 2nd week of December, 41 cords and 2 face ranks of kindling, birch bark bundles, and dry sumac, light fuel for starting fires fast. Tollef stood in the chamber and looked at the work. The stacks filled the space in ordered bays, each one crib-locked, air-laned, raised, and dry. Barbro's carpenter's square hung on a nail driven into a crack in the limestone wall. The test bundles hung in their places. The turnip basket sat empty near the entrance. Barbro was not there. She had come the previous day, tested the rear bundle, pronounced it dry, and left without ceremony. She had taught him everything she knew about keeping fuel sound underground, and now the teaching was over. What remained was the test. Tollef tested splits from 3 depths in the 2nd week of December. He carried front rank oak to his stove and struck a match. The birch bark curl caught. The shavings caught. The split hissed once. A trace of surface moisture from the entrance draft, and then the flame climbed the dry grain and the firebox filled with steady orange heat. Good. He carried mid-chamber oak to the stove. Birch bark. 3 curls. The split lit clean after the 3rd curl. No hiss. No spit. The flame moved along the grain like it was following a road. Better. He carried rear stack kindling to the stove and snapped it over his knee. The wood broke clean with a sound like a knuckle cracking. He did not even need the birch bark. A single match on the broken edge, and the kindling was burning. Barbro arrived while the rear stack kindling was still burning. She looked at the flame, looked at Tollef, and nodded once. From Barbro Assen, who had watched her husband build charcoal stacks that burned for days without collapsing, that nod was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You will not open the whole cave when panic comes," she said. It was not a question. It was the final rule. Ration from the left bay first, work forward, keep the rear dry. If you open everything at once, mercy will waste what madness saved. I understand, Tolef said. You understand now. You will understand differently when a woman is standing at the cave mouth holding a child who has stopped shivering. Do not let the child's silence empty the cave. Ration, or the last 10 families get nothing. She left. Tolef sat beside the stove and watched the kindling burn down to coals that held their heat for 2 hours. Outside, the December sky was the color of wet iron. Birds fed low along the creek, jabbing at frozen mud. The creek itself was a puzzle, ice forming on the banks, melting under warm rain, refreezing overnight into a jagged shelf that grew an inch each cycle. He found clear ice on a sumac branch after a mild Wednesday drizzle and broke it off. A shell of ice around a living branch, clear as window glass, thick as his thumbnail. He carried it to town in a bucket and set it on the counter at Satterwhite's store. This formed in one night, Tolef said, on a branch. Imagine it on your woodpile. Oren looked at the ice in the bucket. The afternoon sun was already softening it. By the time 3 men had gathered to look, the shell had cracked and slumped into water. Brekka brings us a bucket of weather, Oren said. Next, he will bottle the wind and sell it as prophecy. The men laughed. Tolef took the empty bucket and walked back up the bluff trail. Behind him, Reverend Cresswell told a knot of women that fear had become Tolef's god, and that a man who worshipped fear would always find something to be afraid of. Dr. Vardaman said nothing. He had seen the ice in the bucket before it melted. He had seen the stacks in the cave. He had felt the air move through the chamber. He still did not believe the prophecy, but he had stopped dismissing the prophet, and in Shannon County in December, that silence was its own kind of weather. On December 27th, the sky opened with warm rain. It began in the late afternoon, a soft rain that had no business falling in the last week of December. The ground was frozen hard to a depth of 4 inches. The fence rails were cold enough to burn bare skin. The temperature had been below freezing for 6 straight days. And then the wind shifted, and warm air rolled up from the south, and rain fell. Not sleet, not snow. Rain. Warm enough to fall as liquid. Cold enough to freeze the instant it touched anything that held the memory of the 6-day freeze. By nightfall, every fence rail in Millstone Ford wore a skin of ice. Thin at first, a glaze, the exact word Tolef had used, a word most people had not bothered to learn the meaning of because sleet and ice storm were close enough. But glaze is not sleet. Sleet bounces. Sleet can be swept. Glaze adheres. It builds. It does not stop building until the warm rain stops falling, or the surface it touches warms above freezing, and nothing in Millstone Ford was warming above anything. By the second morning, every exposed woodpile in town was sealed. The ice was not a crust that could be chipped away. It was a shell that had formed around each individual split, filling every crack, every gap, every space between the bark and the wood. Men went to their piles at dawn with axes and wedges. The axes bounced, the wedges skidded on glass-smooth surfaces and shot sideways into shins, into boots, into frozen ground. Oren Satterwhite sent 3 of his men to work on his commercial pile, the largest in town, 6 cords stacked in an open yard under a split rail shed that stopped snow but had never been tested against freezing rain driven sideways by a south wind. They broke 2 axe handles before noon. The first morning, families laughed. An inconvenience. A story for the store. Children threw chunks of ice-glazed bark at each other and slid on the frozen mud between cabins. Women doubled their indoor kindling use, burning through the small boxes of dry splits kept beside the stove for quick starts. By noon, the kindling boxes were low. By nightfall, the kindling boxes were empty. The first chimneys went cold that night, not all at once. The families with the smallest indoor reserves went first. The Kittredge cabin, Alma Kittredge, widow, 2 children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 4, lost its fire at 9 in the evening. Alma had 3 splits of indoor wood left, and all 3 were green elm that a neighbor had given her in October because green elm was better than nothing. Green elm in a cold stove produces smoke, steam, and rage, but very little heat. She burned all 3. The stove warmed for an hour, then died. By the second night, half the chimneys in Millstone Ford were cold. Dr. Vardaman's stove went out while he was tending a feverish child in the back room of his house. The child was Nora Wick, 6 years old, daughter of a sawyer who was out on the ridge trying to cut ice-free wood from standing timber and had not returned. Vardaman had indoor oak, but his supply was 3 days old and had been stacked near the door, where the freezing rain had found the gap under the frame and glazed the bottom tier. He burned the top splits. He burned a chair leg. He burned the shelf boards from his examination room. The feverish child shivered under 2 quilts, and Vardaman sat beside her with no fuel and no way to get any, because his outdoor pile was a monument of ice and his axe was in the shed with a cracked handle. Orrin tried pouring boiling water over his commercial pile on the second morning. The water melted a thin channel in the ice, ran down the splits, and refroze within 20 minutes into a thicker, smoother shell than before. His men stood around the pile with kettles of cooling water and faces that had stopped laughing the day before. On the third morning, Alma Kittredge wrapped her 2 children in every blanket she owned and carried them to the church schoolroom, where Reverend Cresswell had kept a small fire going by burning hymnals and the pine bench seats. The schoolroom was warmer than her cabin, which was now colder inside than the well house, because at least the well house was small enough that body heat could register. Nettie Kittredge, the 7-year-old, had stopped shivering. That was when Vardaman understood what was happening. When a body stops shivering, it has not warmed up. It has given up trying. The cave entrance was sealed. Wind-driven, freezing rain had coated the plank and hide baffle that Tollef had built to slow mist while preserving airflow. The baffle, which was meant to protect the interior, had become a wall of ice. The same glaze that locked the town's woodpiles had locked Tollef's front door. Tollef stood at the entrance with a hand axe and a flat iron bar, chipping at ice that reformed almost as fast as he could break it. The warm rain was still falling. Every chip he knocked free left a wet surface that glazed over within minutes. His right shoulder, the one he had torn carrying splits in November, screamed with each strike. His footing was treacherous. The gravel approach was sheathed in ice, and twice he went down hard on one knee. Peter Vangen appeared on the trail with a sled. He was not pretending anymore. He had not been pretending since the November freeze that glazed his own pile. He had a pry bar, a mallet, and a face that had passed through doubt into something harder and more useful. "The whole front is sealed," Tollef said. "I can see that." They worked together. Peter drove the pry bar into the seam between the baffle planks and the limestone arch. Tollef struck the bar with the mallet. Ice shattered in sheets that fell inward, away from the rain, onto dry gravel where they could not refreeze. They cleared a gap wide enough to crawl through in 40 minutes. Tollef tore his shoulder worse on the last strike. Peter caught him when he staggered. "Can you lift wood?" Peter asked. "I can lift wood." They crawled through the gap into the chamber. The air inside was steady, cool, dry. The stacks stood on their rails exactly as they had been stacked, crib-locked, air-laned, untouched by the ice that had sealed every other piece of fuel in Shannon County. Tollef pressed his hand against a front rank split. Dry bark, cool wood, no moisture, no ice, no glass shell. He pulled a split from the front bay. Then another. Then 5 kindling bundles. He loaded them onto Peter's sled through the gap in the baffle and sent Peter down the trail to Vardaman's house, because Vardaman had a feverish child and no fire, and a feverish child without heat was a dead child by morning. CTA. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because what happens at the cave door changes every judgment made against him. Vardaman was sitting beside Nora Wick's bed when Peter kicked open the door with an armload of cave oak. The doctor did not ask where it came from. He did not ask how it was dry. He cleared the cold ash from his stove, laid birch bark in the firebox, stacked kindling on top, and set a split of white oak across the andirons. He struck a match. The birch bark caught. The flame moved to the kindling, curled upward, and found the dry edge of the oak split. The wood did not hiss. It did not spit. It did not smoke and smolder the way every piece of outdoor fuel in Millstone Ford would have smoked if anyone could have pried it free from its ice coffin. The flame climbed the grain, the firebox filled. Heat rose from the stove in waves that Vardaman could feel on his face from 4 feet away. Nora Wick was warm within the hour. She was not well, but she was warm, and warm was the difference between a sick child and a dead one. Peder made 7 trips that first night. Tollef loaded the sled from the front bay, rationing 1 armload of kindling, 6 stove-length splits per household. Barbro's rule, not generosity, arithmetic. The cave held 41 cords. 28 households needed heat. If he gave freely, the cave would empty in 3 days. If he rationed, it would last through the worst of the glaze and leave a reserve for the families who would need it longest. The hardest moment came on the 3rd morning. Alma Kittredge appeared at the cave mouth carrying Nettie, who had not shivered in 6 hours. The child's skin was pale and waxy. Her breathing was shallow. Alma's face had passed through panic into something worse, the flat calm of a mother who has accepted that she is watching her child die and cannot make it stop. Tollef looked at the child. He looked at the front bay, which was half empty after 2 days of rationing. He looked at the rear bay, where the driest, most carefully stored wood sat untouched. Barbro's final rule lived in his chest like a stone. Do not open the whole cave when panic comes. Ration from the left bay first. Keep the rear dry. Barbro had taught him the rule. Barbro had also taught him to see what was in front of him. He pulled kindling from the rear bay. The driest splits in the cave, the ones that snapped like bone, the ones that caught on a single match. He loaded Alma's arms and sent her to the schoolroom, where Cresswell's bench fire had died, and the room was barely warmer than the air outside. The kindling caught in the schoolroom stove before Alma had finished unwrapping Nettie's blankets. Heat filled the room. Nettie did not shiver. She did not respond at all for nearly an hour. Then her color changed, pink replacing gray, and she made a sound, not a word, not a cry, just a small exhale that meant her body had remembered that living was something it could do. Tollef stood outside the schoolroom in the freezing rain and pressed his forehead against the ice-slick doorframe. He had broken Barbro's rule. He had opened the rear bay. Mercy over arithmetic. But the child was alive, and arithmetic does not breathe. By the 4th day, every warm room in Millstone Ford was burning cave wood. Tollef did not soften the rationing after the rear bay breach. He tightened it. 1 armload kindling, 6 stove lengths. Return with sled. No hoarding. Families who tried to take extra were turned away. Peder stood at the cave gap and counted splits. The glaze held for nearly a week. Warm rain alternating with bitter freezes, each cycle adding another layer to the ice that encased every outdoor surface. The town's woodpiles remained locked. Oren's commercial pile was a sculpture of glass. Men who had spent the first day laughing spent the 4th day standing in line at the base of the bluff trail, waiting for cave wood with empty arms and full silence. On the 5th night, the temperature dropped hard enough to stop the rain. On the 6th morning, the sky cleared. On the 7th day, the ice began to crack under winter sun that had no warmth but had enough light to start the slow work of thaw. Millstone Ford had lost livestock. Roofs had collapsed under ice weight. Orchards were shattered, limbs torn from trunks by the mass of accumulated glaze. Fence lines were down. The creek bridge had buckled. Oren's store had a crack in the front wall where ice had expanded in a seam between logs. But no household had frozen after reaching the cave ration line. Not one. 28 households, the church schoolroom and Vardaman's sick room, all fed from 41 cords of split oak that had sat in a limestone chamber 3 miles from town, raised on locust rails, crib-locked, air-laned, and dry. Every fire in Millstone Ford that week had started on the first match. The town gathered outside Bell Hollow Cave on the 7th day, not to mock, not to observe, but to count what remained. Tollef stood at the gap in the shattered baffle with Peder beside him and his torn shoulder held against his chest. His face was gray with exhaustion. His hands were wrapped in rags that had once been a shirt. His cough was deep and wet from limestone dust and cold rain, and 6 days of carrying wood through a gap barely wide enough for his body. He did not speak. The stacks inside spoke for him. Bay 1 was empty, Bay 2 was half gone. Bay 3, the rear bay, the one Barbaro had told him to keep sealed, was open because a child had stopped shivering and arithmetic had lost the argument. The cave had held. The wood had burned. The town had lived. And the only man who had known it was coming was the one they had sent away. Dr. Amos Vardaman removed his gloves before shaking Tollef's hand. It was a deliberate act, performed in front of 14 people standing outside Bell Hollow Cave on a morning when the ice was still cracking from the fence wires, and the sky was the pale blue that follows a week of misery. Vardaman pulled the left glove first, then the right, folded them into his coat pocket, and extended his bare hand. Tollef took it. His own hands were wrapped in rags. The skin beneath was cracked, swollen, and stained with limestone dust and dried blood. Vardaman held the grip for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than Vardaman held anything. "I knew how cold enters a body," Vardaman said. "You knew how cold enters a town." He released the hand and stepped back. The people watching understood what had happened. Vardaman had not apologized. He had not admitted he was wrong. He had done something more precise. He had defined the boundary of his own knowledge and acknowledged that Tollef's knowledge existed on the other side of it. In Millstone Ford, where Vardaman's word had been the final authority on survival for 20 years, that handshake was a transfer of credibility that no town meeting could have accomplished. Tollef said nothing. He had not planned a speech. He had not imagined this moment during the months of hauling and stacking, because imagining vindication is a luxury that belongs to people who have energy to spare, and Tollef had spent every spare calorie on oak splits. The measurable results did not require interpretation. Orin's exposed commercial pile had lost most of its usable value. The ice had penetrated deep enough that even after the thaw, the outer tiers were waterlogged and would need weeks of drying before they would hold a flame. Households with small indoor boxes had lasted 1 to 2 days. The families who had kept the most indoor kindling, the cautious ones, the ones who had stacked a week's worth beside the stove, had outlasted the others by 36 hours, which, in a glaze that lasted nearly a week, was the difference between discomfort and danger, but not the difference between danger and death. Tollef's raised cave stacks had fed 28 households, the church schoolroom and Vardaman's sick room through the worst of the glaze. The rationing system had worked. Bay 1 was empty. Bay 2 was half depleted. Bay 3, the rear bay that Tollef had opened for Nettie Kittredge, had lost 6 bundles of kindling but was otherwise intact. The cave still held enough fuel to supply the town for another week if the glaze returned. It did not return. But the town did not know that yet, and the uncertainty was itself a kind of education. Peter Vangen did not have a conversion scene because Peter had never fully doubted. He had questioned the method, tested his objections against the evidence, adjusted his position when the evidence changed, and shown up with a sled when the evidence became overwhelming. His conversion had happened in stages too quiet for an audience. What Peter did, in the week after the glaze broke, was something more useful than public acknowledgement. He walked the cave from entrance to rear wall with a lantern and a notebook. He measured the rail heights. He counted the crib locks. He paced the air lanes. He sketched the drainage trenches. He asked Tollef questions that were not about whether the method worked. That question was settled, but about how it worked, and why, and what would happen if the dimensions were changed. If the rails were 12 inches instead of 18, would the drainage still clear? Peter asked. Depends on the gravel depth, Tollef said. Here the gravel is 10 inches to bedrock. 12-inch rails would work. In a cave with a clay floor, you would want 24. And the air lanes, could you narrow them to 1 hand width? In a dry chamber, yes. In a chamber with any seep, no. The air has to move fast enough to carry moisture out. Narrow the lane, slow the air, the wood sweats. Peter wrote it down. He was not a man who thought in abstractions. He thought in loads and distances and the weight of things on axles. What he was building in his notebook was not a theory, but a specification, something that could be repeated by a man who had never met Tollef Brecka in a cave he had never seen, using the same principles scaled to different conditions. That notebook would matter later. But in January of 1886, it was simply a teamster writing down numbers because numbers were the language he trusted. The community came to Tolef the way water comes to a low point, not all at once, but steadily, following the path of least resistance. First, the men. They came in pairs, standing at the cave entrance with their hats in their hands, asking questions they framed as idle curiosity, but that carried the weight of having watched their families shiver for a week. How high should the rails be? How far from the wall? What kind of wood holds up best? Whether hickory stores as well as oak? Whether a root cellar with a stone floor could serve the same purpose as a cave? Tolef answered every question. He did not lecture. He showed. He walked each visitor through the cave, pointed to the crib locks, explained the air lanes, let them feel the test bundles, let them snap a split and smell the break. He put the knowledge in their hands and let their hands tell them what their pride would not. Then the women. They came alone or with children, and their questions were different. Not how to build, but how to prepare. How much kindling should stay indoors? How to know when wood is dry enough? How to stretch a short supply? Whether it was worth burning furniture or whether the smoke would make things worse. Tolef answered those questions too. He showed a woman named Elda Pruitt how to test a split by pressing her thumbnail into the end grain. If the nail sank easily, the wood was green. If it resisted, the wood was ready. He showed Alma Kittredge how to stack her indoor box with the driest splits on the bottom and the kindling on top, so the heat from the stove's residual warmth would keep the lower splits from absorbing moisture overnight. He refused payment for the emergency wood. This was not generosity, it was strategy. If people paid, the wood became a transaction, something purchased, owed, and forgotten. If people worked, the wood became a system, something built, maintained, and remembered. The terms were simple. Each family that took emergency fuel from the cave must build a covered raised crib before taking any spring allotment from what remained. The crib did not need to be large. It did not need to be in a cave. But it needed rails that lifted the wood off the ground, a roof that shed rain sideways instead of channeling it down the pile, and enough air gap between rows that a man could slide his hand through without touching wood on both sides. 14 families agreed within the first week. The other 14 took longer, but by the end of January, every household in Millstone Ford had either built a crib or was building one. Orrin Satterwhite watched this happen the way a man watches a river change its course away from his mill. He could not deny the cave had worked. The ice on his commercial pile was evidence that melted slowly enough for everyone to see it. His men had spent 4 days chipping fuel free after the glaze broke, and the wood they recovered was waterlogged, smoke-prone, and worth a fraction of what dry oak would have brought. His customers, who had been buying winter fuel on store credit at prices Orrin set, had just spent a week burning free wood from a cave managed by the man Orrin had helped banish. So Orrin shifted. He could not attack the method. He attacked the messenger. At the next town gathering, not a formal meeting, but a Sunday after service crowd in the churchyard, Orrin stood and spoke in the reasonable voice of a man who has everyone's best interest at heart. Nobody here denies that Brika's wood kept stoves burning, Orrin said. The question is whether one man, operating alone, answering to no one, storing a town's worth of fuel in a cave on public land, is the right arrangement for Millstone Ford. What happens if Brecka takes sick? What happens if he decides who gets fuel and who does not based on personal grudges? The cave should be placed under orderly management, store management, with records, with fair distribution, with oversight from people this town has trusted for 20 years. He meant himself. Everyone in the churchyard understood that. Orrin was not conceding defeat. He was attempting to absorb the victory, to place himself between Tolef's method and the community that now depended on it. Tolef was not at the gathering. Petter told him about it that evening, standing at the cave entrance while Tolef restacked the depleted front bay with fresh splits from a dead oak he had felled that morning. He wants the cave, Tolef said. He wants control of the cave, Peter said. The wood, the rationing, the authority. If he manages distribution, he manages credit. Same system as the store, different building. Tolliff set a split on the rail and tapped it with the axe head. It rang clean. Sound wood. Let him try, Tolliff said. The cave is not a store. You cannot manage what you did not build and do not understand. The first time Oren stacks a cord without crib locks, it will fall on him, and I will not be there to dig him out. It was not bravado. It was the flat assessment of a man who had spent months learning what Oren had spent minutes dismissing. The cave was not a resource to be seized. It was a system that required knowledge to operate, knowledge that lived in Tollef's hands, in Barbro's chalk marks on the limestone walls, in the carpenter's square hanging from a nail in the chamber ceiling. Oren could claim the cave. He could not claim the understanding. Barbro Ossen came back to Bell Hollow in the second week of January, 1886, not because she was needed, because the work was not done. The Glaze had proven the cave could save a town. It had not proven the cave could sustain one. Tollef's stacks had been depleted by the emergency, and the system needed rebuilding, not just restocking, but improving. Barbro saw gaps that the crisis had revealed. She arrived with her carpenter's square and a piece of chalk and spent 3 hours marking the cave walls while Tollef hauled fresh splits from the ridge. Bay 1 is your emergency reserve, she said, drawing a line on the limestone at shoulder height. It empties first and refills first. This is the wood you give without asking questions. Bay 2 is the schoolhouse. The schoolroom stove burns more than any household because the room is large and poorly chinked. Cresswell will not fix the chinking because he believes God provides warmth to the faithful. You will provide warmth to the children regardless of Cresswell's theology. Bay 3 stays sealed until you say otherwise. Not Oren, not Vardaman, not the constable. You. Because you are the one who knows what a second Glaze looks like, and they do not. They worked side by side through the short January days. Barbro could not lift a full split, but she could lift a half split, and she could position crib locks with a precision that Tollef still could not match. They disagreed about the entry shed. Tollef wanted to rebuild the bafflesy, the plank and hide screen that the Glaze had sealed. Barbro wanted something different, a narrow shed built against the cave mouth, roofed with overlapping cedar shakes angled to shed freezing rain away from the entrance. The shed would not seal the cave. It would deflect the rain before it reached the opening, so the baffle behind it would never face direct ice buildup. You are building a second wall, Tollef said. It blocks airflow. It blocks rain. The airflow comes through the gaps between the shakes. You cannot seal a cave mouth and keep it breathing. You can shed rain and keep it breathing. These are different problems. They argued about it for 2 days. Barbro drew plans on the cave wall. Tollef drew alternative plans beside them. They erased each other's chalk marks and redrew them until the wall looked like a battle map. On the third day, Barbro built a small model from bark and sticks, propped it against a rock outside the cave, and poured a cup of water over it. The water ran off the angled shakes and fell to the ground 18 inches from the model's base. No water entered the space behind it. Air moved through the gaps between the shakes freely. Tollef felt the draft on his hand. Build the shed, he said. Barbro did not say she had been right. She said, I will need locust posts, 4 of them, and you will need to stop arguing with me when I have already tested the thing you are arguing about. They built the shed together in 5 days. Barbro held the posts while Tollef set them. Tollef lifted the shakes while Barbro nailed them. The work was slow because they were old and tired, and the January cold made every joint stiff and every nail hard to start. But the shed went up, and behind it the cave mouth breathed clean air, while the winter rain fell harmlessly onto the cedar shakes and dripped away. The bond between them was not sentimental. It was the bond of 2 people who respected the same things. Careful work, sound materials, the difference between a structure that holds and one that collapses. Barbro called Tollef stubborn. Tollef called Barbro impossible. Neither of them changed. In the evenings, after the work was done, they sat at the cave entrance and ate whatever Barbro had brought. Turnips, dried apples, cold cornbread, sometimes a piece of salt pork she had traded a goat for. Barbro talked about Mikkel during these evenings, not in the way of grief, but in the way of a woman who had spent 13 years alone and had simply not had anyone to tell. Mikkel had built charcoal stacks that burned for 6 days without collapsing. He knew the temperature of a kiln by the color of the smoke. Blue for too hot, white for too cold, gray for correct. He had survived 3 kiln collapses and lost the hearing in his left ear from the 4th, the one that killed him. Barbro had pulled him from the rubble with her own hands and carried him 200 yards to the road before she realized he was no longer breathing. She told Tollef this on a night when the stars were hard and bright and the temperature was 15 below, and the cave behind them was full of wood that would burn clean on the first match. She told it the way she taught, through specific detail, without commentary, letting the facts carry their own weight. Tollef listened. He did not offer comfort, because Barbro was not asking for it. He offered the last piece of cornbread, and she took it, and they sat in silence while the cold pressed down and the wood behind them waited. Barbro died in late October of 1886. Chest fever. It came on fast, the way it does with old people who have spent too many winters breathing cold air and too many summers working in kiln dust. Tollef brought her camphor oil, and the carbolic salve Vardaman had left him a year before. Vardaman came to Barbro's cabin twice. He could hear the fluid in her lungs from across the room. On the last day, Barbro made Tollef restack a leaning corner in the cave's second bay. She could not walk to the cave, so she described the problem from her bed, a settling of the 6th row in the crib lock nearest the rear wall, caused by a rail that had shifted on the gravel. Tollef fixed it that morning and came back to tell her. "Did you tap the replacement split?" she asked. "I tapped it. It ran clean." "And the air lane beside the lock, did it narrow when you restacked?" "It held 2 hand widths." She nodded. She reached under her pillow and pulled out the carpenter's square. Maple and brass, worn smooth along the inside edge from decades of use. She held it out. "This was Mikkel's," she said. "It does not belong in a grave." Tollef took it. He held it the way a man holds a tool he knows he does not deserve but will spend the rest of his life trying to earn. Barbro Assen died that night. The last thing she saw was the lantern Tollef had set on her windowsill, the same kind of steady yellow light that had lit the cave chamber through every cord she had helped him stack. Some people leave behind children, some leave behind land. Barbro left behind a carpenter's square and a set of chalk marks on a limestone wall that told a town how to keep fuel dry when the sky tried to seal it. She would have preferred the chalk marks to a eulogy, and Tollef knew that, so he did not give one. He hung the square on the nail in the cave ceiling beside his lantern hook, and he went back to work. The cave was quieter without her. The corrections stopped. The arguments stopped. The small, precise adjustments that Barbro saw and Tollef missed, those stopped too, and in their absence Tollef had to learn to see them himself. He checked every crib lock by hand. He paced the air lanes with his palm extended, feeling for dead spots where the draft faltered. He tested the bundles on Barbro's schedule every 2 weeks, lifting and snapping and shaving and smelling, because the routine was hers, and keeping it was the only eulogy that meant anything. He did not teach the way she taught. He was rougher, less patient, more likely to show a man the mistake by letting it happen than by preventing it. But he taught, because the cave needed more hands than his and more knowledge than one head could hold. The second crisis came in January of 1887. A thaw rolled in from the south, sudden and violent, the kind of warm front that turns frozen creeks into brown floods inside 12 hours. The low bridge over Mill Creek, the only crossing between Millstone Ford and the 3 farms on the east bank, buckled under the ice and debris. The water rose 4 feet above the bridge floor and kept rising. 3 families were stranded on the far side. The Wickham family, the Dorsets, and old Maud Selby, who lived alone and had not been seen since the thaw started. Between them, they had perhaps 2 days of indoor fuel. Their outdoor cribs, built the previous spring under Tollef's instruction, were raised and covered, but the flood had reached some of them, and the ones that had not reached were on the wrong side of a creek that was running too fast and too deep to cross on foot. Tollef stood at the near bank and looked at the water. Brown, fast, full of broken limbs and fence debris. The bridge pilings were still standing, but the planks were gone. He could not cross. No one could cross. The water would not drop for days. He could hear Barbro's voice in his head, calm and precise. Do not open the whole cave when panic comes. Ration from the left bay first. Keep the rear dry. But Barbro had also said, I will need locust posts, 4 of them, and you will need to stop arguing with me when I have already tested the thing you are arguing about. Barbro solved problems by building things. Tolliff could not build a bridge, but he could build a supply route. He sent Pater with 2 loaded sleds up the Ridge Road, a track that ran 3 miles above the creek, over the high ground, and down to the East Bank farms from the north. It was steep, rutted, and half-washed by the thaw, but it was above the floodwater. The sleds carried cave wood from Bay 1, emergency reserve. No questions asked. The East Bank families had fire by nightfall. Maud Selby, who had been sitting in a cold cabin with a dead stove and a blanket over her shoulders, wept when Pater kicked her door open and stacked kindling beside her firebox. She was 78 and had not cried since her husband's funeral in 1871. CTA. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tolliff managed the crisis without Barbro, but he managed it using every rule she had built. Ration from the left bay. Move only the marked amount. Send Pater with the sleds. Warm the schoolhouse first, which in this case meant warm the stranded families first, because they were the ones without alternatives. Keep the rear bay sealed. He kept the rear bay sealed this time. No child was dying. No one had stopped shivering. The crisis was serious but not lethal, and Tolliff had learned the difference between mercy that saves and mercy that wastes. Barbro had taught him that difference by telling him the rule and then watching him break it. He would not forget which lesson mattered more. The flood lasted 5 days. The bridge was rebuilt in February by a crew that included Pater, 3 East Bank farmers, and Tolliff, who could not lift heavy timber but could tell the crew where to set the piling so floodwater would pass under instead of through. Orrin Satterwhite made his move during the flood. While the town was focused on the East Bank families and the bridge collapse, Orrin built a shed behind his store. Not a large shed, 20 feet by 12, with a pitched roof and open sides. He filled it with wood purchased from a downriver supplier and posted a sign, Certified Dry Firewood, Winter Ready, Fair Prices on Credit. The shed had no raised rails. The wood sat on bare ground. The roof was pitched for snow, not for wind-driven rain. The sides were open to whatever the weather brought sideways. It was, in every way that mattered, a conventional woodpile with a hat on. Orrin priced the wood at $3 a cord on credit, which was twice what deadfall cost to cut, but half what panic would bear. His calculation was simple. If people bought from him, they would owe him. If they owed him, he controlled them. The cave had disrupted that system, and Orrin intended to restore it. For 3 weeks, the shed looked like proof that Orrin knew what he was doing. The wood was dry when it arrived. Customers who could not afford to spend time cutting and hauling their own fuel bought from Orrin instead. Then a rain and freeze cycle came through in mid-February. Not a full glaze, a minor event, 2 days of freezing drizzle that would not have threatened anyone with a raised crib and a covered stack. Orrin's shed stopped the snow. It did not stop the sideways drizzle that blew through the open walls and coated the lower tiers in a thin shell of ice. The wood smoked. It spat. It hissed and steamed and refused to hold a flame without 15 minutes of coaxing with birch bark and prayer. Families who had bought Orrin's certified dry fuel found themselves nursing sulky fires while their neighbors, the ones with raised cribs built to Tolliff's specifications, burned clean. Orrin's reputation did not collapse. Reputations built on 20 years of store credit do not collapse from one bad batch of firewood, but it cracked. A visible, audible crack like the sound a split makes when the grain is flawed and the weight finds it. People heard it. People remembered. Tolliff said nothing about Orrin's shed. He did not need to. The wood spoke for itself, the same way it always had. Dry wood burns. Wet wood does not. The principle did not require a spokesman, but the principle did require a system and the system required a man willing to maintain it, and that man was now 64 years old with a torn shoulder, a limestone cough, and a mentor's carpenter's square hanging on a nail in a cave that the town needed more than it had ever needed Orin Satterwhite's store. The question was no longer whether the method worked. The question was whether one man could carry it forward alone, without the woman who had taught him to see what he missed, without the strength he had spent on 41 cords of oak, without the certainty that comes from having someone beside you who understands the same things you understand. Tolliff hung the carpenter's square back on its nail after the flood. He checked the crib locks. He paced the air lanes. He tested the bundles. The cave was sound. The system was sound. The man inside it was tired, and the winter was not over, and the person who would have told him to rest was buried on a quarter section south of town where the goats still grazed and no one had thought to close the gate. By the spring of 1887, Tolliff Breka had stopped being a story and become a system. He held the first public workday at Bell Hollow Cave in March, when the ground had thawed enough to haul, but the trees had not yet leafed. 14 men and 6 women walked the bluff trail carrying axes, saws, and the particular silence of people who have come to learn from a man they once ridiculed. Tolliff met them at the cave mouth with Barbro's carpenter's square in his hand and a piece of chalk behind his ear. He did not make a speech. He split a piece of post oak, held it up, and tapped it with the axe head. The wood rang. "That sound means it is ready," he said. "If it sounds dead, it is wet or cracked. Do not stack dead-sounding wood. It will rot and take the splits beside it." He walked them through the cave. He showed them the rail heights, 18 inches on deep gravel, 24 on shallow. He showed them the crib locks, perpendicular cross ties every 6 feet, 2 rows deep. He showed them the air lanes, 2 hand widths, floor to ceiling, every 8 feet. He showed them the chalk marks Barbro had drawn on the walls. Bay 1 for emergency, Bay 2 for the schoolhouse, Bay 3 sealed until ordered. He showed them the test bundles. He lifted one, snapped a split, shaved the edge, held the shaving to the lantern. He passed the shaving to the nearest man, Orrin Wickham, one of the East Bank farmers whose family had been stranded during the flood, and told him to rub it between his fingers. "Dry," Wickham said. "That is what dry feels like," Tolliff said. "Remember it with your hands, not your head. Your head will tell you wood looks dry when it is not. Your hands will not lie." He taught the way Barbro had taught him, through action, through specific detail, through the insistence that knowledge lives in the body before it lives in the mind. He was not gentle about it. When a man stacked a row without checking the crib lock spacing, Tolliff made him pull the row and restack it. When a woman tied a kindling bundle too loose, Tolliff untied it and handed back the cord without a word. He was harder than Barbro, less patient, more likely to let a mistake stand long enough for the person to feel it shift before correcting it. But the knowledge transferred, because the knowledge was physical. Measurements, weights, sounds, textures, and physical knowledge does not require eloquence. It requires repetition and consequence. The workday lasted from dawn to mid-afternoon. By the end, the front bay was restocked with 8 fresh cords. The entry shed had new shakes where the winter wind had loosened them. The drainage trenches were cleared. 13 people had learned to tap test a split, tie a kindling bundle, and sight a crib lock for alignment. Tolliff stood at the cave mouth and watched them walk down the trail. Peter was last. He carried his notebook in one hand and an axe in the other. "Same day next month?" Peter asked. "Same day every month until the cave is full and every household has a crib that does not leak." Peter nodded and started down the trail. Then he stopped. "Barbro would have hated the way you taught today," he said. "Barbro would have taught it better," Tolliff said. "But Barbro is dead, and I am the one who is here." A second raised platform was built from black locust in April. Peter designed it. Longer rails, wider spacing, enough surface to hold an additional 12 cords in the back half of the chamber where the ceiling was highest. The locust was harder to work than the original rails, but it would outlast oak by decades. Barbro would have approved of the material and criticized the joinery, and Tolliff could hear her criticism clearly enough to fix the worst of it before the first cord went up. The entry shed was reinforced with a second layer of cedar shakes, overlapping the first at staggered intervals. A narrow walkway was cleared between the shed and the cave mouth, wide enough for a loaded sled to pass. Tolliff chalked guide marks on the limestone walls so that anyone hauling wood in lantern light would not scrape the stacks or clip a crib lock. A tally board appeared in May. Pater built it from a planed oak board and hung it inside the cave entrance. Each household that contributed labor or wood received a mark. Each household that drew emergency fuel received a different mark. The board was not a debt ledger. It was a participation record. A way of making visible what had been invisible so that the families who hauled and stacked could see their work counted, and the families who had not yet contributed could see the empty space beside their names. Children joined the system in summer, not by Tolliff's design, by their mothers. Women sent their children to the cave on Saturday mornings to gather birch bark and dry sumac for kindling bundles. The children treated it as a game at first, racing to fill their baskets, daring each other to venture deeper into the chamber. Tolliff let them play until one of them knocked a test bundle from its hook. Then he sat them on the gravel floor and showed them how to tie a kindling bundle so it would light on one match. "Bark on the outside," he said. "Sumac in the middle. Tie it here and here. Not tight. The fire needs to breathe the same way the cave needs to breathe. If you choke it, it dies." A boy named Caleb Dorset, 9 years old, tied the best bundle Tolliff had seen from anyone under 40. Tolliff held it up, turned it in the lantern light, and set it on the drying rail without comment. Caleb understood the compliment. No one makes a fuss over a bundle that meets the standard. The standard is the praise. By autumn of 1887, Pater had designed a sled route from town to cave, marked by cedar stakes driven into the ground at every turn. The route avoided the steepest grades and the muddiest hollows, so that a loaded sled could make the 3-mile trip in under 2 hours even in poor weather. The stakes were painted white at the top so they could be found in snow. The system was no longer Tolliff's. It belonged to Millstone Ford the way the creek belonged to the valley, not because anyone owned it, but because everyone depended on it and no one could remember how they had managed without it. Orrin Satterwhite's grandson was born in the spring of 1886. His name was Harlan. He had his mother's narrow face and his grandfather's stubborn jaw, and by the age of 1 he had survived croup, a summer fever, and a fall from a porch railing that left a scar on his forehead shaped like a crescent moon. In the second week of January, 1888, Harlan developed lung fever. The winter had been moderate, cold but not bitter, dry but not desperately so. No glaze, no crisis. The kind of winter that made people forget why they had built raised cribs and stacked cave wood in August. Orrin's store stove burned fuel from his own shed, the same open-sided shed he had built 2 years before. He had not raised the rails. He had not added crib locks. He had replaced the wood that the February freeze had ruined and gone back to doing business the way he had always done it. The January rain came on a Tuesday. Light freezing drizzle, barely enough to notice, enough to coat the lower tiers of Orrin's shed pile in a film of ice that did not look like much and turned out to be everything. Orrin's stove smoked. The wood hissed and spat and refused to draw. He burned through his indoor kindling in 4 hours. His daughter, Harlan's mother, wrapped the child in quilts and held him near the stove that was producing more smoke than heat. Harlan's breathing was wet and shallow, the sound of lungs filling with fluid, and the room was cooling because the stove was failing, because the wood was glazed, because the shed had open sides and no rails, and no crib locks. Orrin came to Bell Hollow Cave after midnight. He came alone. He did not bring his hired men. He did not bring his reasonable voice or his proposals for orderly management. He came as a grandfather carrying a lantern up a bluff trail in the dark, with ice on his beard and panic in his chest and the specific humility of a man who has run out of alternatives. Tolliff was asleep on a straw pallet near the cave entrance. He slept there most winter nights now, close enough to hear if anyone approached, close enough to check the entry shed if the wind shifted. He woke to the sound of boots on frozen gravel and the yellow swing of a lantern coming up the trail. He knew who it was before the light reached the cave mouth, not by sight, by the weight of the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, the walk of a man who is accustomed to being watched and has forgotten how to move without an audience. "Brecca," Oren said. His voice was stripped of everything it usually carried: authority, calculation, the careful management of other people's impressions. What remained was a man's name spoken by a man who needed something he could not buy. Tolliff stood. He did not ask what Oren wanted. He could see it in the lantern light, the ice on the coat, the breath coming too fast, the eyes that had stopped calculating and started pleading. "Harlan," Oren said. One word, the child's name. It carried everything. Tolliff walked into the cave and pulled kindling from Bay 1. Emergency reserve. No questions asked. Barbro's rule. He pulled splits from the front rank, dry oak, the kind that caught on birch bark and burned clean within minutes. He loaded Oren's arms. Then he stopped. "Alma Kittredge's cabin first," Tolliff said. Oren stared at him. "My grandson is—" "Alma's stove is cold. Her children are asleep under every blanket she owns. Her crib was damaged in the November wind, and she has not had help repairing it. You will carry wood to her cabin and stack it beside her stove. Then you will go home to Harlan. Brecca, the child will survive 20 minutes. Alma's children have been cold for 3 days because the woman who saved them during the Glaze cannot lift a crib rail alone, and no one in this town has thought to help her because helping a widow does not generate store credit." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Bell Hollow Cave had ever held. Oren carried the wood to Alma's cabin. He stacked it beside her stove without waking her. He did not knock. He opened the door, set the splits on the hearthstone, and left. Then he went home to Harlan. The kindling caught in Oren's stove on the first match. The oak split followed. Heat filled the room in minutes. Harlan's breathing did not improve immediately. Lung fever does not yield to warmth alone, but the child stopped shivering, and Oren's daughter stopped holding her son as though he were already gone. Vardaman arrived at dawn and treated the child with camphor steam and warm compresses. Harlan survived. He would grow up to haul wood to Bell Hollow Cave on Saturday mornings alongside Caleb Dorset, and he would never know that his grandfather had stood in a cave at midnight with ice on his beard and learned what it felt like to need something he could not control. Oren Satterwhite broke publicly the next morning, not dramatically, not with a speech or a confession. He walked to the meeting house after service and signed a paper that Pater Vangen had drafted. The paper granted permanent access rights to the ridge trail east of Bell Hollow, the same trail Oren had threatened to close 2 years before, the same trail his timber right notice had tried to block. He signed it in front of 11 people, and when Reverend Cresswell asked if he wanted to say anything, Oren said, "The trail is open," and walked back to his store. He never became warm toward Tolliff. He never acknowledged the cave system as anything more than a practical arrangement he had no further objection to. He never apologized for the banishment, the timber right notice, the store management proposal, or the certified dry shed that had smoked in February and again in January. But he never again sold wet wood as winter ready. And on the Saturday mornings when Harlan walked up the bluff trail with the other children, Oren watched from the store porch with an expression that was not pride, not shame, but the complicated stillness of a man who has been proven wrong by someone he has not yet figured out how to forgive. Alma Kittredge became central to the Bell Hollow system without anyone deciding she should. It began with the kindling bundles. After the first Glaze, when Tolliff was rationing cave wood through the crisis, Alma had organized the distribution at the schoolroom end, counting splits, tracking which families had received their allotment, keeping children away from the stove while wet wood dried on the hearthstone. She had done it without being asked, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had run a wash house alone for 6 years, and understood that systems require attention even when no one is watching. After the Glaze, she began appearing at the cave, not for fuel, for work. She repaired kindling bundles the children had tied poorly. She swept the entry shed. She maintained the tally board, adding names, marking contributions, noting which families had fallen behind on their crib maintenance. Tolliff noticed her the way he noticed a well-set crib lock, by the absence of problems where problems should have been. The tally board was accurate. The kindling bundles were tight. The entry shed was clean. He did not compliment these things because complimenting maintenance is like complimenting breathing. It is expected. Its absence is what demands attention. Their courtship, if it could be called that, happened through split oak and chalk marks. Alma challenged him first. In the spring of 1887, she found him carrying a full cord of splits on his back up the bluff trail, 20 trips, 60 pounds each, because Svan had finally gone lame beyond recovery and Tolliff had not yet found a replacement mule. "You will kill yourself before the cave needs you," Alma said. She was standing at the trailhead with a handcart she had built from wash-house scrap lumber and iron wheel rims. The cart held 4 splits at a time. It was not elegant. It rolled poorly on the rutted trail. But it rolled, and rolling was easier than carrying. "I did not ask for a cart," Tolliff said. "You did not ask for a cave full of wood, either. You built it because it needed building. I built the cart because you needed a cart. We can argue about it, or you can load it." He loaded it. They argued about stacking methods. Alma believed the front bay should be reorganized by household succumb, each family's allotment marked and separated, so distribution was faster during a crisis. Tolliff believed the bay should remain a common reserve, distributed by need, not by name. "Names create debts," Tolliff said. "Debts create orans." "Common reserves create chaos," Alma said. "During the Glaze, Pater counted splits at the gap because you did not have a system. If you had died on the trail, no one would have known what to give or who had already taken." They compromised. Bay 1 remained common for emergencies. Bay 2 was divided by household allotment, marked on the tally board, distributed by Alma's records. Bay 3 stayed sealed, as always, under Tolliff's authority. The compromise worked. It worked because Alma understood something Tolliff did not. The cave was no longer one man's project. It was a community's infrastructure, and infrastructure requires administration as much as it requires engineering. Tolliff could build a stack that held for years. Alma could build a system that ran without him. They married in the schoolroom in the autumn of 1888. No grand ceremony. Reverend Cresswell read the service. Pater stood as witness. Nettie Kittredge, now 10, carried a bundle of dry sumac tied with hemp cord instead of flowers, because Alma had told her that useful things were more beautiful than decorative ones. Barbro's carpenter's square rested on the stove shelf during the service. No one mentioned it. Everyone who knew what it was understood why it was there. By 1890, Bell Hollow Cave held 3 managed bays. Emergency, schoolhouse, and widow and orphan reserve is totaling 52 cords at peak season. Each household in Millstone Ford maintained an indoor dry box and a raised outdoor crib. The August woodcutting that had once been Tolliff's solitary obsession was now a community calendar event, marked and anticipated the way planting and harvest were marked. Peter Vangen became the system's wagon captain. He scheduled the hauls, maintained the sled route, replaced the cedar stakes when weather knocked them down, and kept a copy of the tally board at his house in case the cave copy was damaged. His notebook, the one he had started during the first inspection after the Glaze, had grown into a detailed manual that covered rail specifications, crib lock intervals, air lane widths, drainage patterns, and wood selection criteria for 9 species of Ozark hardwood. Vardaman wrote the storage method in the Shannon County paper in the spring of 1889. His account was clinical and precise, as Vardaman's accounts always were. He described the cave dimensions, the rail heights, the stacking method, and the results. He did not mention the banishment. He did not mention the meeting house. He mentioned Tolliff by name once as the method's originator, and Barbro by name once as the structural engineer. Vardaman understood that a method described without names was a method that would be claimed by whoever printed it second. Spring deadfall rites were shared among all households. Autumn inspection became a ritual. Tolliff and Alma walking the cave from entrance to rear wall, testing bundles, checking locks, pacing lanes, while children swept the entry shed and Pater oiled the sled runners. The phrase Brecca's madness still circulated, but its meaning had inverted. It no longer described the delusion of a frightened old man. It described the standard that Millstone Ford held itself to, the obsessive, careful, particular attention to dry wood and sound stacks that had kept the town alive when the sky turned to glass. Tolliff and Alma lived in a small cabin near the cave path, not the dog trot cabin that Orrin had seized. That building had passed through two other owners and was used as a feed shed. The new cabin was tight, well chinked, with a covered porch that faced the bluff trail so Tolliff could see who was coming up and who was going down. Alma kept a kitchen garden on the south side. Tolliff kept the carpenter's square on a shelf beside the door, where he could reach it without standing from his chair. They did not have children together. Alma's two ours, Nettie and the boy, Thomas, grew up in the system. Thomas became a passable woodcutter. Nettie became something better, a teacher. By the age of 14, she could tap test a split, sight a crib lock, tie a kindling bundle, and explain the physics of thermal stability in a limestone chamber to a room of adults who had never thought about it before. She did not explain it the way Tolliff explained it, through demonstration and silence. She explained it the way Barbro would have explained it, if Barbro had been the kind of woman who used words as freely as she used chalk. Tolliff grew slower. His shoulder never fully healed. The limestone cough settled into something permanent, not debilitating, but present, a dry rasp at the back of every breath that reminded him of every cord he had stacked in the dust of that first desperate autumn. He still walked the cave weekly. He still checked the crib locks by hand. He still tested the bundles on Barbro's schedule every 2 weeks, lifting and snapping and shaving and smelling. He became more exacting as he became less capable. Children sent to stack wood learned that Tolliff would forgive a dropped log. He would not forgive a blocked air lane. He would not forgive a kindling bundle tied too tight. He would not forgive a split-stacked bark up when it should have been barked down. These were not rules he could explain through patience because they were rules that had been burned into him by consequence, by collapsed stacks and glazed wood, and a child who stopped shivering, and a woman who died with chalk dust on her fingers. The carpenter's square wore smoother every year. The brass edge thinned. The maple darkened with oil from 100 hands. It was the most used tool in Shannon County, and it had been built for a charcoal burner who died in a kiln collapse in 1873. Within 10 years of the first glaze, 3 neighboring settlements copied the Bell Hollow system. Cedar Bluff built a smaller version in a sandstone overhang. Eminence used an abandoned root cellar expanded to hold 20 cords. Round Spring adapted the design for a half cave near the river, adding a stone wall to close the open face. Each settlement sent someone to Tolliff for instruction, each person left with the same knowledge: raised rails, crib locks, air lanes, test bundles, and the rule that mattered most: wood is not fuel until fire can reach it. Tolliff Brecka died on the 14th of October, 1897. He was seated on the limestone ledge beside the cave entrance during an autumn inspection. Barbro's carpenter's square lay across his knees. Alma found him there when the light changed, and he had not come down the trail. His hands were resting on the square the way they rested on everything he trusted, open, still, with the fingers slightly curved, as though he had been holding something that had just finished being measured. Winter rain came to Millstone Ford that December. Warm and patient, the kind that froze on contact, the kind that turned fence wires to glass and sealed every surface that stood open to the sky. Orrin Satterwhite, 73 now, stood on his store porch and watched the rain fall. He did not go to his woodpile. His woodpile was raised, covered, and crib-locked. It had been for 9 years. He watched the ice form on the road and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the ice did not say better. Somewhere in the hollow, a voice he had once dismissed echoed in the rhythm of the rain. Brecka's stacking summer inside a hole because winter talks to him in his sleep. The chimneys of Millstone Ford smoked in a steady line against the gray sky. Children carried dry kindling from the cave mouth, stepping carefully on the icy trail, their bundles tied tight with hemp cord. The exposed world shone under its glass skin, and every fence wire, every bare branch, every open surface wore the glaze that Tolliff Brecka had spent his life preparing for. Inside the cave, A lantern hung from the limestone arch. Steam rose from wet mittens drying on the ledge. A boy named Harlan Satterwhite pulled a split of white oak from the front bay, set it on the loading sled, and struck a match against the rough bark to test the draw. The flame caught on the first strike, climbed the dry grain, and held. The town had banished the only man who listened closely enough to hear winter coming.